Hey guys, I am Dr. Kim Sage. Thank you so much for joining me today. This video is going to do a dive into children of narcissistic parents versus children of borderline parents, and some depth around where we see the wounds and struggles and a direction for kind of where you want to go when you want to work on healing if this is your story. As many of you know, I have a lot of experience and both personal and professional in this area, specifically around people raised by borderline and narcissistic parents. I myself was raised by a parent with borderline, and I had my other parent who struggled with, it's hard to know because I lost him young, but I would say a form of mental illness really focused on narcissism, some borderline, and certainly complex trauma and depression. And so I've had a lifetime of it. And I also, unfortunately, replayed and reenacted a lot of my generational and childhood trauma over the course of my life, which I have been working on repairing for many, many years now. So when I share this content and my courses and everything I talk about, it really is coming from a place of wanting you to know so desperately what I wish I knew, and to hopefully help be a companion in some way on your healing journey. Whether it's, stopping the process now, trying to heal the wounds, trying to parent differently, and maybe think about how your trauma might manifest in your life and relationships. I just hope that these videos are helpful. We're going to start on a series really diving into sort of attachment and complex trauma at the hands of parents who struggled more and more. I find that it's really important to honor and validate our pain, and you will definitely find that in the course I just created and posted recently called Understanding and Healing and Dealing with the Trauma of Your Borderline and/or Narcissistic Parents, and then a second course called Remothered, about taking the internal wounded inner child and transforming that into a loving, present, engaged mother, so you can mother yourself with also steps and actions in healing. And then also a course on invisible wounds, identifying childhood emotional abuse and neglect, and that is a free course. All of the courses have workbooks and journals and even meditations. The courses on borderline and narcissistic parents, that course has a 100-page workbook plus about 5 to 7 meditations in addition to all of the videos, about 74, exercises and lessons. And then the Remothered one also has about a 30-page journal and workbook, and also includes several inner child healing and transformative sort of meditations for you to use. So let's get that out of the way and get to the topic. I really wanted to, as I've really spent this last 8 months building this crazy amount of material in this course, I kind of thought I understood it, and I definitely do, but just all of the books and all the resources, it really hammered home to me how important it is in our development when we have parents who struggle. And though narcissism is kind of everywhere and going through the trend right now, as complex trauma is also sort of trending, it's really not a trend when you have been wounded by these experiences. And so I want to keep it from being kind of pop psychology and just try to really focus on healing and understanding it so that you can really, chart your own course. So when we look at personality disorders, what we're really looking at are, it's like the skin wrapped around a person. It's just who they are. It doesn't come and go like depression or anxiety, though for many of us, those things never leave either. And so we can also see a layering of personality disorders. We can see traits. So you might find that a parent or someone you know has traits, but not the full diagnosis. And, we're not looking to label everyone. I think that's really important. I'm always going to keep saying it, but especially around borderline in both men and women, I just want the younger generation to understand that when we were, most of us, trained, it was like a borderline was a unicorn and you would just know it when you saw it, right? And that's not that's not the case. Many of us were not really trained the way we should have been to understand and diagnose and treat borderline. We know now there are really strong emerging amounts of research pointing to a very strong biological and genetic link to borderline, as well as to childhood trauma and trauma in general. And I want to say this, that oftentimes I post about borderline, and people who have this disorder often will feel me giving research-based points about what happens to children. It feels hurtful to them at times, and I understand that, and I don't want you to have that. But I also want you to understand that there is an impact. And for many of us, as I was saying earlier, raised by parents who suffered in this way, no one ever said they were borderline. Most of them told them now, they would say, no, I'm not. But when we go back and look at where they struggled emotionally and relationally, in terms of identity, it's so present. And so many of us who grew up with parents like this, and this is obviously still the case now because treatment is hard to find and still, although it's so much more successful, not easily accessible. But so many of us were very much invalidated, and that's what I really want to do here on this channel as well. So the same is true for narcissism. I think that certain types of, over the course of time, parenting is evolving, but people that are either wounded, either genetically or from their childhood or whatever, and have these difficulties, especially with narcissism, really don't often see any role in it. I do find that those with borderline, especially the younger-ish generation, are much more open to acknowledging and understanding it. And they are obviously, we know, much more motivated in terms of, therapy and treatment and research. Now, really quickly, I'm going to keep saying it before I go into this, but the spectrum of borderline, I think, is really vast and wide. And many of the studies are done on clinical populations, people who are in treatment programs. So that's kind of at the high end. But we also have people who are high functioning, who might be a more quiet or vulnerable sort of borderline type person or presentation, who seems more like a victim. The same is true for narcissism. All of these things are really on a spectrum. And so we want to make sure we're acknowledging the wide experience for people, but also kind of trying to frame it within, this might be kind of like immature, not great parenting, but this really falls into the dynamic more of a borderline or narcissistic presentation. Both can be very wounding, but I think the higher up the spectrum you go, especially when it comes to stronger traits of narcissism, where the parent just really could never really see you and it's very conditional, to the dynamic in borderline, where we have a lot of splitting. There's splitting in narcissism as well, but it's really strong in borderline, where you're either all good or all bad, and oftentimes the person with borderline feels that way. And so then the child, often we grow up as kids of these parents kind of also splitting with ourselves, right? We're either good or bad. And so that's just where it makes it challenging, because I always say, I just don't think you get as much attempt at empathy and mirroring and attunement with narcissism. But people with borderline, oftentimes, when it's good, it's really good. It's just that when it's hurtful, it's just really, really hurtful, especially when it's a consistent pattern directed toward a child who has no power. And that is the dynamic. It's that we want to have compassion, but you have to understand, if you were raised by or are an untreated, really struggling human who has borderline traits or the strong, characteristics, you have to understand that your emotional and relational difficulties, your child just sees as that's how you are. That's how they are. They take their meaning and cues from you. And so that's why I also want to shed a light on it so much, that we need more treatment and more support for really every area of mental health. Okay, so let's go into the core differences between, let's just assume for this example that we can see up to 40% layering of BPD and NPD, but let's just kind of pretend for this example that we have a purely, a narcissistic parent raising us, and then a purely more borderline type presentation raising us, if we're looking at the core wounds, okay? So both of them, to start with, often create highly invalidating environments, right? That basically means that you are not validated. Your perspective, at least consistently, is not. And at the heart, we often see a real lack of insight, a difficulty with sort of theory of mind and understanding how I impact you in these disorders, or not really seeing it at all. And so a child is going to feel at the core, even if you are so loving when you're loving, if you're hurtful and wounding on the flip side pretty consistently, or you just completely rage at them with both of those, the child is never going to feel safe. And so the really core of this is that the person who is supposed to love you most, especially in borderline, but it can be in narcissism as well, is the person you most need to protect yourself from. And if you just let that sink in for a minute, the safest source of the entire universe, your primary caregiver, the person you want to most be loved and safe with, is also the most hurtful person in your childhood. And so that is really, it's really a mind screw. And it's really the heart of the complex trauma, which I believe is often really the foundation, and why I talk about that so much also in my course. Okay, so for the parent of a child, if a parent has borderline, what we really see here is that when they have a child, and oftentimes, this is going to fall more towards the mothering figure, whoever that is. In many cases, we're talking about mothers because mothers are still the primary figure. But especially in that mother-child or mothering dynamic, oftentimes those with borderline kind of see the child as an insurance against never being left, right? The child is not really here. It's not this intentional thing, but to grow up and be a separate self. Oftentimes, this is why I say, please, for the love of God, stop saying that your child is your only or best friend, because your child is not here to be your best friend, right? You can be friends with your child at times. You can be friendly. As adults, you can work on that. But the child is not here to take care of your emotional needs. And that is the definition of a best friend, right? A best friend is supposed to have a reciprocity, and that is not how parenting is supposed to work. And so oftentimes there's this deep longing to never be left or abandoned at the core of borderline. And so having a child in some ways, I think, makes them feel like, well, now I never will be, because that love is so deep. It's not that they don't feel that love. It's just there's this enmeshment, this as I always say, it's like this. Instead of seeing it as, I'm parent, your child, we're going to grow together, and my job is to someday let you go and release you into the world. I think many people with borderline struggle with that. It's almost like the umbilical cord must never be severed with them. And they don't really want you to have that true separation and independence, because that is a threat to you then leaving them. And so that means that your other, as you become older, people you date, your friends even, oftentimes parents are like, I don't like so-and-so. And, they kind of foster this drama because they don't really want you to leave and choose someone else. And where you really often see it, and I've seen this a lot, is if you have a borderline parent, especially a mother, and you get married, there's often a lot of conflict. And often your spouse, whoever they are, just often not, has told you, your mom keeps hurting you. Why are you in this relationship? Pretty much everyone ends up telling you that if it becomes really unstable. And so they really see this obligation, though, the parent does, for the child to stay loyal. And anything the child does that pushes against that feels like a direct threat. And that's oftentimes when they will strike and be really hurtful. You can be from in their light and loving to being just the worst. That's that splitting. You were the good child when you took care of me and took me to lunch and whatever. But now that you're setting a boundary, you're the bad child, right? And so that makes it really hard because their dependency needs as a borderline parent are so strong. Now, all of this is assuming that there's no treatment, no real attempts at healing and awareness and things like that, right? And so in some ways, it's like this emotional manipulation to try to keep you there. And because it's often there's such a toxic enmeshment that the child, sometimes the adult child, doesn't want to leave the parent. they've learned that attachment is this sticky, enmeshed bond. And that's why I've said at times with my own mom, I would go from like, oh my God, like I'll never be able to live without her, to I've got to get away from this. This is so unhealthy. And it just, that trauma bond goes back and forth, back and forth. And so I think the trauma bond is much more common with a borderline parent, because you have that enmeshment where there are times where it feels like your needs are getting met and it's good. And oftentimes parents who don't want you to leave them, and this goes for both, but they will set up this currency where their money, their babysitting, they're paying for your vacations or whatever it is, they use something to keep you connected to their life, where you feel like, well, if I set boundaries, they'll cut me out of the will. Or if I, speak up and push back, which you've often been taught not to, because we can see a lot of rage and anger, both with narcissism and borderline. You think, I can't do that, that's going to blow up and not go well, and you've learned to avoid conflict. And so all of this creates this just sort of like, this wound that is hard to break and get out of. And so what happens for the child is that as an adult, you often do that thing inside too, where you're good and bad. And you often can reflect a lack of stable sense of self, much like those who have borderline do, which is one of the criteria, this unstable sense of self, this identity shifting. And so you can have that where you're like, well, I don't know, am I a good person or bad person? I'm either so loved or so hated. And your attachment is really so strong that getting out of that can be very, very difficult. Now, when we look at children of narcissists, what we see here is that a narcissist doesn't necessarily see the child as someone who will never leave them. They see it as an extension of them, right? The child is a reflection of the most valuable qualities that the narcissist thinks they have and want that child to reflect. And so that is why it is so much more about what it looks like than what it feels like. And narcissistic parents have this, whatever it is, what they value, but it's often success, beauty, fame, whatever. And so the children that most reflect those qualities that the narcissist most wants to have and believes they have, those are the kids who are favored, right? Those are the golden children. We hear the golden child dynamics. And those who are not are discarded or blamed, right? That's the scapegoat, the invisible or lost child, because you don't know what you're doing with your life, so that's not great. But this kid over here getting a 4.0 or 4.8 and going to Harvard, right? That's my kid, right? And they will, in front of the kids, reward so much more to the golden child. I mean, it's literally, they will say it. You're so much more valuable. I love you so much. They will give them more valuable gifts. You do not see, it's all even in family dynamics with most narcissistic parents. And so there's a hierarchy where the parent's like, I know everything. You know nothing. You never will, right? Unless it's something that I think is, reasonable or valuable. And so the child often feels invisible, discarded, very conditionally loved, only lovable and worthy when they are performing and delivering. And so they don't have that same dependency dynamic, but there can be these strings attached, because every child, we all want to be loved by our caregivers. I mean, we're wired to want that and to thrive when we get that. And so that is the heart of the dilemma. It's like, I only matter when I am reflecting you. And so then also, who am I? But oftentimes those with narcissism, the children, will also internalize at times part of those narcissistic qualities, where they start to think that same thing. They can have some of those traits where it's like, well, yeah, I'm only good when I'm performing, and so are you, right? If you're not doing a great job, you're not worthy either. And that's a dilemma for them, because they have to break all of that apart in their own psyche and structure psychologically to look at their own value. And so it's a little bit easier sometimes to just take on those traits and project that same stuff onto others. Now, because of their different value systems in terms of a borderline and narcissistic parent, the borderline child has been trained to be enmeshed and attached and often trauma bonded. And so their work is really about, like I said, separating from enmeshment and figuring out who they are, working on the attachment wounds, oftentimes that disorganized attachment style, which is, like I said, the source of safety. The parent, the one you're supposed to be most loved by, is also the person who is the most dangerous and hurtful. Also true in narcissism, and also depends on the role of the narcissist, right? A very disengaged narcissistic father is going to have a different impact than a hands-on mother who was the narcissist, who was around the kids 100 times more. And because we have rage often with narcissism, or even internalized repressed rage, and with borderline, another whole video is how do we deal with the anger, when we've been raised that way. But it can make pushing back and developing an identity really difficult. And so it really is this challenge to figure out, who am I and where am I valuable? The task of the child of a narcissist is to take that internalized value system that they have been, sort of wired and trained to see in the world as good, bad, and only good when it's, powerful, successful, beautiful, is to begin to break that down and to look at who they are and what matters, and to kind of take apart those relationship patterns. And the task for a child of a borderline parent is about getting out of that trauma bond, like I said, in enmeshment, also looking at who am I. Both of them often need boundaries, and really addressing that core attachment, because it's not so simple. I find it much easier for people raised by narcissistic parents to try to set boundaries, to have a surface relationship, to sometimes decide, because they can't do anything else, to go no contact, because they never really got that love they needed. And the flip side is with a parent with borderline, oftentimes you did get some things, or they do provide childcare or money or whatever in your life, and it's because they have a vested interest in keeping that attachment, and you do too in some ways. It can be really hard to break apart that sense of self and to sort of reframe. Ideally you would work on the relationship with both, and you wouldn't have to go no contact, and you could set boundaries, and sometimes that does really work, and other times it doesn't. And so it really depends on those issues. In the next few videos, we're going to go deeper into being raised by borderline, narcissistic, and really wounded parents, and how all the different dynamics play out, and then what you're going to have to sort of work on in terms of your healing tasks, or what I would suggest, what the research says, and sort of a lens or pathway on how to do that. So I hope this video was helpful. I'm so glad you're here, and if you are new and you'd like to subscribe, please consider doing so. Please check out my courses. I really spent, as a child and a clinician with so much experience in these wounds and these stories, I really wanted to give you everything from complex trauma to your, adverse childhood events study score, to understanding polyvagal theory and your nervous system, which is so vital to healing, to everything you need to know about being raised by parents like this, and then real healing exercises on grieving, on you becoming a compulsive caretaker, on enmeshment, on toxic hope, on disenfranchised grief. I mean, I just went on and on. I know that it's not an easy thing to access financially. I will say that there is more information in this course on borderline narcissistic parents than I could ever provide, and it is definitely less than just 2 sessions with me, which isn't really enough to do anything, to be honest, right? I mean, this work is so much about our complex childhoods and wounds. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope to see you soon. Please check me out or follow me. Check me out sounds so like I'm like 100. Please consider, following me on TikTok. I'm telling you, if you're not on TikTok, it's got its issues, but it's really amazing. I've learned and found so many incredible creators to follow, and everything in life, from cooking to therapy to just comedy and entertainment to education. It's pretty amazing. And so I do post at least once a day there, and always on these topics. I'm going to be doing a series there on just like understanding mental health terms, I call therapized, therapy concepts, and which is some of my favorite music to kind of tap into your nervous system, because music really can help with that. So please check out the video I just posted actually a few weeks ago. I think maybe it was a month ago or so. Actually, it's November, on how to understand your nervous system. If you don't know much about it, I would really encourage you to go watch that right now, because that is going to be, no matter what you do in your healing journey, a vital part of your healing is learning how to soothe and calm your nervous system and recognize your triggers and all of that. So anyway, thanks for watching, guys. I will see you soon. Please stay safe and well, and I will see you next week, actually. Take care.